Hello, I'm Simon, also known as Polyhop. Today we'll be working with TouchDesigner in combination with Joseph Pilt's T3D to make this quantized reaction diffusion system behind me. Well, okay, it's a bit more complicated than that, but I needed a short title, and shaping noise through quantization to create a bounding volume for 3D reaction diffusion is frankly a bit of a mouthful and also didn't fit on any of my title slides. So yeah, we're going to go with the short one. I hope you enjoy. It's a really fun system, and I've definitely shared it in some of my sketches, so excited to kind of show how simple this actually is. Now, since this tutorial makes use of T3D, you'll need access to the full set of components. Those can be found on Joseph's Patreon, which is linked in the description. Before we begin, I also want to thank all my own Patreon supporters and give a special thanks to my top supporters. On Patreon, you'll gain access to exclusive example files and tools. You can vote on future tutorial topics and more. So yeah, let's get started. Before we begin, I am assuming you have installed T3D 1.8. That is the version we're using. To install it, you drag the Tox into the network, and it should automatically install, and then populate the T3D tab on the op create dialog. We're going to start by using noise to create a volume that our reaction diffusion will ultimately fill. So I'll start by creating a base here, and we can just call this Quantized noise T3D, customize the component, and I'm going to add a few parameters here just to speed things up. One is resolution. So I will set the range max here to 200 and the default to 160. This will be the resolution of our 3D texture in all axes. I also know I will want a quantization step, so I'll make that a float. This one can have a default of 0.05 and maybe go up to all the way to 0.5 in case you want to explore that value. And then also a threshold, which we'll leave at 0.5. Great, so let's jump inside. And I'll start by creating a noise T3D operator. So this one on the common page, let's set the pixel format to 16-bit float. And then on noise, I'll increase the period to 2 and remove the harmonics, so I'll put those both at 0. I also want to set the resolution to my parent resolution parameter. So I'll choose bind, the purple button, or lavender, and I'll do parent.pair.resolution, and I'll copy and paste that for each of those 3 resolution values. You should see a grid like this now, where you have a rectangle in the bottom left, which is the first Z slice, and then you actually get to view all of those slices all the way through the 160. So really this is like 160 pixels by 160 pixels. It is a square, even though it stretches it to a more of a rectangle. So just know that, sometimes this view can be a little bit tricky to read, but we are looking at all 160 slices of our 160 by 160 pixel grid. I also want to transform this, and I'm going to use abs time.frame times 0.0004. So a very slow animation of this noise. You can play with this, speeding it up if you'd like. It has a pretty dramatic effect. So that's partly why I'm using such a slow animation. From there, I'm going to use a pair of limit T3D operators. So the first one, we'll use quantize and round, and then I will set that position step to that parent.pair.step parameter, actually making sure I put that in the bind section and pasting it in each of my steps. So this is a pretty subtle quantization, but you'll see it more dramatically in the once we render the volume. I'll also copy and paste this, and here I'm going to take the same position step and I'm going to offset it by half. So just dividing that parameter by 2, also in each of the 3 values here. So now we have 2 quantized versions of our noise, but they're slightly offset exactly by half of a step. Now I can take the threshold of this, and I am going to map this as well to I'll bind it to our parent parameter. So parent.pair.threshold, and I'll copy and paste this as well. So these two should look very similar to that offset in the 2 quantization passes. The edges here are also offset by our quantization step. I will go on to use a subtract T3D operator to get the difference of the 2. Now we're getting some +1 and -1 values. You can see that with the black. And if you wanted to hit A and N and hover over, you can actually see that the values are 1, -1, and 0. So I am going to use a math operator just to use a positive pre-op since I want these all to be a value of 1 or 0. And here you can really see that it looks more like a shell. If you think about this as kind of stacks, then these lines actually stack on top of each other and sometimes move slightly. So, imagining 3D noise, but as just an outline, almost like it's hollow on the inside. So lastly, I want to visualize this in some way. So we will use the surface operator here. And there we go. The built-in viewer shows us our quantized noise. So here you can see the 3D version of that shell I was describing earlier, where we only get pixels in a quantized band around the threshold value of 0.5. So here you could take a moment, play with the quantization step, play with the threshold, and really get a feel for how those affect the final output. So now that we've created our quantized noise bounding volume, let's go ahead and set up a render network. I'll start by going to tops, and I'll drop down a render top. And let's set this to 1080 by 1080 in the resolution, so I can see what we're doing. I'll drop a null at the end, toggle our display flag, Alt left bracket, or you can use the split left right dialog in the top right to split our screen left right, slide this over, Alt 4, or drop down for the top view, and then right click on the left, display backdrop tops off. Cool. So now that we have our view on the right, let's drop down a camera, and you can at least see our noise is being rendered, though it's not being lit currently. So let's go ahead and add some lights. Before I do that, I want to choose the PBR, or physically based rendering material type. And then we will need an environment light to be paired with our PBR setup. I often use HDRI, or high dynamic range images, with environment lights. It gives more of a realistic quality, but you can also use noise as a quick way to vary the color, and that's the approach we'll take here. So here, I often use a higher resolution than this, but for the sake of the tutorial, we'll use 1080 by 540, since that will give us a something that'll work with non-commercial licenses. And I'll drop a null at the end. So this will be what we'll drag onto our environment in a moment. But first, I want to color this. So I'll add a lookup and a ramp, and then spend just a moment dialing in the colors of my ramp. So you can experiment with your own colors here. Just note that once we drag this onto the environment light, changes to this network can be sort of slow. So I often will also copy my ramp, make some changes, and then patch it in, since it can be a little bit frustrating as like dragging these parameters will slow down your whole network. So let's drop this into environment map. And now we're seeing something happening. That's great. Let's also adjust our camera slightly. So I am using an orthographic view, and I've positioned it at 2, 2, 2. However, right now our camera isn't looking at our geometry. So to fix this, I'll create a null and drag that onto the look at, since our geometry is at 0, 0. So now we've got a cool kind of a diagonal orthographic or isometric view of our noise. And I'll go ahead and drag the metallic and the roughness down. Actually, the metallic can go up. There we go. So yeah, high metallic, kind of lowish roughness gives us that really reflective and vibrant color. And you can sort of see how our noise is being represented. We have different patches of those colors that we chose showing up. I might go ahead and drop my period down just so I get more density of color changes. We can also give our colors some motion by animating the environment map rotate parameters. Here I'll use abstime.seconds times 0.2. Actually, let's use abstime.frame since we want it to rotate a bit faster. Abstime.frame. There we go. So now we're getting a color shift, which is kind of nice. I'm also going to rotate my surface as well. And for this, I'll use a separate null. I'll just call this null underscore rotate. And for my geo, I'll choose specify parent object and drag my null onto it. Now for this null rotate, let's rotate in the Y. So we're rotating kind of on the Y-axis, and I'll type abs time.frame also times 0.2. So now we've got our form rotating and our environment light rotating, so we're getting our colors shifting around. Before we kind of do much more, let's just add a couple pieces to our render setup just to make this look a little bit snazzier. So I am a big fan of SSAO in moderation. It can be quite heavy, so you can always dial the quality down if your system is struggling. So we'll choose full for the resolution, drop the surface avoid angle, pull the sample directions up to maximum. I usually don't use the blur radius unless I have to, and I'll use a lot less of the contrast, so I'll pull that down. And then, yeah, that's about right. Cool. So you can turn off combine with color to see how it's actually showing. And then that's another way to dial in and try to avoid some of these artifacts. So you can always bring these values up if you'd like, right? But it does take a performance hit to do so. But just a little bit of shading. And then we can also add some bloom. And it's way intense, but we will adjust that. So let's bring down the radius, bring down the fill, and the level a little bit. So we're just getting a little bit of bloom here and there. I'm also going to matte this over black. There's a lot of ways to do this. I like using the constant just because it's really clear in the name of the operator what the purpose is. So set it to black, go to the output, and choose over, and then swap the order. And here's, a good first step towards our quantized noise. All right, so The next thing I want to do is add some smoothing to this because it's really jittery when the noise animates. So anytime one of those cells pops between a quantized cell or value, then we just get it popping in and out of existence. So in order to work with this, I'm going to give myself some space here and use a feedback loop to smooth my values. So I'll start with a null that will be my starting point of my feedback loop. I'll add a feedback top, also a cross. So this will let me mix between these two inputs. So I can mix in my current value with the previous value to dial in how fast those pixel values are transitioning. I'll follow that with a null, and I'll just name these. So this will be end feedback and start feedback. I'll drag my end feedback over to feedback. So I have this sort of a loop right here, and then I can drag that into surface. And I'll adjust my cross value to around 0.925 works, just around 0.9. So now we have our feedback loop, but it looks a little bit jittery. It's different, but it's still kind of blipping in and out. If we look closely, we can see that those values are fading, but it's not quite as smooth as I want. So we'll take a look at that in the next step. Before we move on, I'm going to adjust the threshold parameter on the surface geo, which determines what values are considered solid or not when it's converted to a 3D volume. And a higher number gives us a more skeletal look where we get these thin bars, which I really like the look of, though you can adjust this value as you desire. So you'll notice that even with our feedback loop to smooth these pixels, we're still getting them popping in and out of existence in our render in a way that's a little bit jittery. So an approach that I took to smooth out the volume was to explore reaction diffusion as a way to build organic patterns and have them shrink and grow in ways that didn't feel discontinuous. So the method that we're using is one that can be done also in tops, and the exact same process works in T3D. So I'm going to demonstrate quickly in a base just to show you how that works in tops before we do it in the 3D operators. Jumping into this base called 2D RD for 2D reaction diffusion, I'm going to also jump in with our viewer here, and I'll start with a circle. I'll set the resolution to 1080 by 1080 and the pixel format to 16-bit float. Our circle can be a little bit smaller. This will serve as our initial state. And then I'll run that into a feedback top. And we're going to use two blurs here. One blur I'll set to 26. And then out of that, I'll create another blur that I will set to a different value. This one will be 30, so it's even further blurred. And then I will subtract these two. If we take a look at the values, we can see that there's a ring of black and white with a gray background. The gray values are actually 0 in this case, while the black values are negative and the white are positive. Once we make this into a feedback loop, this gradient will drive the rate of change towards 0 or 1, giving us our patterns. We're now going to create a math top, and I'll set the multiply to 50. And I'm also going to create a limit and clamp our value so that it is clamped at 0 and 1. Now, if you look at this A and N, you'll see that once I multiply it, we're getting values that are much higher, -4 and 5, and ultimately clamping it down to 0 and 1 with our limit. The benefit of this is our multiply can control the speed of the reaction, while the limit keeps it from getting out of control and completely jumping into NaN or not a number values that are just way out of range. So this kind of tamps it down. We're also going to now create a null. This is our end feedback, and I will drop that onto feedback. And you should see we're getting these choral-like Turing patterns that grow. So really simple system, and definitely one that you can play with more. It's a fun way to get these sorts of patterns. But now let's look at how to do that in 3D. So our 3D system is essentially what we just did in 2D, but with our 3D operators. So we're going to start with a box T3D operator. These will be our initial pixels, or our initial state. I will start by using the same resolution that I did for our noise. So I can even grab that from parent.pair.resolution and pop that into our bind for each resolution value. Now I don't want softness here, and I'm going to drop the scale down to 0.2, and then make sure I also change my pixel format to 16-bit float. From here, I will create a feedback top and a blur T3D operator set to 3 passes, followed by a blur T3D operator with 4 passes. We'll also subtract them. And then from here, create a math T3D operator, multiply by 50, limit to clamp our system from 0 to 1. And then I will also create another box. You can toggle this off to see what the effect is, but essentially I want to clamp the edges. And so I'm going to go to 0.95, and then for output, choose multiply. And end our feedback. So a null, and I'll call this end feedback. It adds the 1 since I already named an operator that. Drag that onto my feedback, and you should see it automatically fill with something that looks pretty similar to what we just did. It is also generating Turing patterns, but in this case, it's also moving up and down our Z slices in addition to in X and Y. Now, we can also see what that looks like by just dropping it into our surface. So this is already looking pretty interesting, and you could certainly refine this further, but our goal is to shape it using that quantized noise from earlier. Before we combine the systems, I do want to add a keyboard in Chop just so I can reset my feedback systems. So I'll drop the Control-Alt for the modifier, make a null, call it reset, open the viewer with A, or this viewer active flag, and then I can drag that value and chop reference for both feedback tops. So now if I press Control-Alt-1, it will reset our feedback and we can watch the reaction diffusion system grow. Now I'll make some room after the limit, and we can create a multiply T3D operator and then multiply it by the results from our quantized noise system. And there you go. We have it. Now you can see how this is the same structure we had before, but now when the noise changes, the form grows or subtracts in a more organic way. It's not popping in and out of existence. Instead, we've ironed out those discontinuities using an additional feedback system. So the last piece here is just to add those additional elements like the box and the grid lines that I think give it some nice context. So I'll show how we do that. For the outside box, we just create a box, and drop a geo at the end. Now we need this to rotate with our same null rotate, so under xform, specify parent object, I'll drop in null rotate, and let's give it a line material. Now I'm going to turn off specify far color, change the color to white, and also set a constant width. Now I also want some subdivision lines, and so I'm going to do that with a grid sop set to 5 by 5 for the rows and columns, so it's not that dense. And I'm also going to offset it by -0.5 in our z-axis. Now to get this on all sides of our cube, I'm going to copy it with a copy sop first 3 times, rotating 90 degrees in the x-axis. And then we're going to create another copy to copy it one more time for the remaining sides. So here, I could do -90, 90, 90, does the trick. And I'll copy and paste my geo here, since it already is set to rotate. And I like this subdivision being slightly thinner, so I'm going to copy my line material and drop that to 1. You can even go down to 0.5. I think I do that in the example. Now, one thing you might notice, it's very subtle, but if we toggle combine color, there are more artifacts that you'll get when using this line material, just because it's also calculating the shadow where these grid lines are in front of our geometry. And so I think it looks a little bit cleaner to exclude these UI elements from the SSAO. So I will rename these grid 1 and grid 2. And then for my render, I'm going to drag in geometry. So surface 1, I'm no longer rendering those grid geos. And then I'll use a render pass to render those instead. So I can type grid star. So anything that has a grid in the name will be rendered. And clear to camera color. So I'm still getting the depth, meaning it's easy for me to just drop this over after my SSAO. And so now I've excluded this geometry from the SSAO pass. I think it looks just a little bit better. So definitely a subtle matter of taste, but it's good to know how to do that when you want to. And that's it. Hope you enjoyed this tutorial. There's a lot more to be had with this system. Certainly playing with the step can give you some interesting changes. Usually these need to be accompanied by additional modifications to say how fast your reaction diffusion is growing or shrinking, for instance. Here we go. So you can see, if you really want to adjust these parameters, there's a lot to be found through changing things like the quantization, even the initial noise parameters. So if you want bigger chunks or smaller, kind of denser blocks, the period will certainly have an effect there. You could speed up the animation as well. The threshold also can be useful, especially when you have varied the density a little bit. It'll control kind of like how many areas are active. But you have to be careful with these kinds of systems. You'll see that I didn't have to tweak it very long before I found an unstable situation where it died off pretty quick. So, there's a lot of different parameters, and I definitely suggest pulling more of them up to the top layer for the purpose of, exploring their relationship. Certainly the blur, you can increase the, using double steps, get really fast and kind of large blur areas. So if you bring the step down even further, you'll see that they toggle really fast now. I've changed the period, so we're getting a really dense noise. So hopefully you can start to see how we can get some really kind of like interesting forms here just by playing with the parameters of these operators. So I hope you can have some fun with it, and thanks for watching.